I'm delighted to get a chance to talk this morning with my colleague, Patsy Lewis. Patsy is a visiting professor and faculty fellow of the Watson Institute here at Brown University, and is also the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. She obtained her PhD from Cambridge University and is the author or editor of multiple books, most recently Pan-Caribbean Integration Beyond CARICOM. Pleasure to have you. Let me ask you, how you see climate change affecting the Caribbean in the next 10 to 20 years.
The Caribbean is at the forefront of the negative effects of climate change. We're predominantly islands, which means that we're most susceptible to sea level rise. Most of our infrastructure, our main economic infrastructure, is located on the coast. Tourism is the main industry for most of the Caribbean small islands. So hotels, beaches, all the things that sustain that industry would be compromised. Port facilities, towns, major infrastructure are also located on the coast. So that's going to have, a direct economic impact. But even before that, we're already seeing the effects of climate change with more intense hurricanes. And the region is particularly susceptible to hurricanes. And these are now coming with greater intensity. It's normal now to have a Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane when most of the infrastructure, the best infrastructure in the region, has been built to withstand a Level 3 hurricane because stronger hurricanes were such rare occurrences. We also have the problem of warming of, increased temperatures, warming the seas, bleaching corals, affecting sea life, possible, freshwater, saltwater intrusion of freshwater reserves. So there are lots of ways in which we are likely to be affected. And part of the problem with the Caribbean is that you're talking about largely small islands, which do not have the variety, the large land spaces to move populations, from compromised areas. So when an event like a hurricane happens, for example, usually the effect is on multiple sectors of the economy or across the whole island. So you might find that the tourism sector is likely to be destroyed or badly affected at the same time as the agricultural sector is affected because, the economic base is narrow. So you find that the effects are outsized in terms of the country, the entire country.
Okay, that puts a bunch of things on the table. I want to ask you more about them, but let me first just one kind of additional implication, I think, of climate change in the region, and this may affect Central America more than the islands, although both, is migration and how the New York Times, at least, did this really interesting study recently, looking at how many migrants the United States might expect from Central America and the Caribbean. And their expectation was up to 30 million climate migrants in the next 30 years on the southern border, which is pretty stark impact. And obviously that's got consequences for both sides of this, right? Of the United States and of the countries that are getting hit hard. So really important stuff. And I guess I wanted to ask you to just go a little bit further in describing how climate change affects the Caribbean differently than other parts of the world.
Before you go on to that question, and I think I answered it partly in the first question, but I want to come to the whole question of migration. We had the experience in the Caribbean when Montserrat's volcano erupted in the 1990s? And Montserrat is still a British dependency. And at the time its population was around 13,000 people. Did Britain open its borders and accept, 2/3 of the island was affected, including the capital city where most of the population was concentrated. Britain took a very long time before they allowed their dependents to seek refuge in the UK. Neighboring Caribbean countries like Antigua and St. Kitts were the ones who opened their doors first. So that gives you an indication of some of the challenges that we can expect with that kind of migration. The Bahamas, the most recent experience was the Bahamas. I mean, of course, you had Haiti and the earthquake, and the US allowing, having the provisions to have people come for a period. I don't quite remember what it's called, but you know what I'm talking about. But the Bahamas, when they had their last experience of the hurricane, and the Bahamas has an arrangement with the US where they don't need visas. And the first Bahamians who left the boat were well-to-do white Bahamians, and they were welcomed, with open arms. And then the black Bahamians started to come, and suddenly the boats could no longer leave; they were turned back. So, I think there are going to be implications, as in terms of who are desirable migrants. I think the same considerations that we're seeing playing out now would continue to play out. So I don't know that, it's really interesting. In disaster movies, when there is a movies that show a huge disaster in the north, which renders it uninhabitable, you see these these large waves of migrants move into the south. And there is no conception that they would be turned away at the borders. There's just an automatic assumption that they would be welcomed with open arms, because this is what humanity is about. Except the reality, we know the reality of trying to move from the south to the north is that there are all of these barriers, and the common humanity is sometimes very difficult to establish. This is just an aside. I always find it interesting. But coming back to your question.
Thank you.
Coming back to your question of how it affects the Caribbean differently. If you're low-lying, like the Cayman Islands, for example, and you see that even more in the Pacific small states, atolls, which are low-lying, sea level rise can be the end of an island. I mean, there was a hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Gilbert in the 80s, where the waters met in the middle of the Cayman. There are lots of very expensive BMWs and luxury cars that were submerged in seawater that ended up in Jamaica as secondhand cars. And, there are people who bought them at discounted rates, knowing that they wouldn't last so very long, but, at least they got the experience of driving a luxury car for a while. But as I said before, because you're small, you have more coastal area in relation to interior area. So a lot of your infrastructure is on the coast. So you're talking about severe economic dislocation when that happens. The more intense the hurricane, the greater the infrastructural burden, the cost of rebuilding, not just infrastructure, but people's homes. I mean, when Grenada had its Hurricane Ivan in 2004, over 90% of the housing stock was damaged. A lot of that severe damage. That is a much greater proportion of a small country's GDP, for example. Fisheries are very important to those islands. So the loss of fish stocks would also be important. Your ability when you're an island to address the recovery, the immediate recovery, or addressing people's needs right after hurricane is also limited. It's more difficult to get to an island when the ports have, as in the French Caribbean, when was it Maria hit, there were lots of yachts that were, cluttered the bay, wrecked yachts that made it difficult to get to the islands. Airports can be submerged or so badly damaged that it's very difficult. So access is also a problem, getting to an island. I remember, was it the outgoing president who said he didn't know how difficult it was to get to Puerto Rico, like after the disaster, it was like a big revelation. So yeah, it's disasters have an outsized effect in a small island. You can't move people from Louisiana to Houston, for example. It's not that easy.
Yeah, and I think paired with what you said earlier about there being kind of a narrow economic base of tourism and agriculture being the core components of this, and fisheries as well. And so when you compound that with the special problems associated with being country, and you mentioned earlier the sort of level 4 and 5 hurricanes, which are now, as I understand it, they are double the frequency that they used to be 25 years ago in the Atlantic Basin, right? And because we know climate change, they may or may not make hurricanes more frequent, but they make the intensity of those hurricanes much higher.
They also aggravate weather conditions like longer periods of drought, heavier rainfall. And you know that when you have prolonged periods of drought and then you have heavy rainfall, then you're talking about mudslides, and also sometimes we focus on hurricanes, but we have had an odd storm that just out of the blue would just sit down and dump tremendous volumes of rain that then affect infrastructure. So the more of these kinds of weather patterns you have, the more problems.
Well, that's actually a nice segue to the next question I had for you, which is really about how climate change is becoming a really central development issue, which is, I think, closer to your core expertise. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about that and help us understand how it's affecting your work.
Coming from the Caribbean, you know that it's a problem. But I think in terms of how I've traditionally seen my work, it really has been how to find a kind of viable path to address the problems that the Caribbean has. A problem of dependency, never earning enough to meet your needs, high levels of unemployment, high levels of inequality, and coming from a perception of the region as being poor, not being, like we talked about, this narrow economic base in terms of tourism and agriculture, but we tend to ignore the fact that there is a solid extractive sector in the Caribbean, gold in Guyana, and increasingly oil. And, one of the largest finds of oil, recent finds of oil in the world is in Guyana. Grenada, my tiny island where I'm from, which is 123 square miles, 100,000 people, have had Russian companies and different people looking for oil reserves. We are very close to Trinidad. It's very unlikely that we don't have oil reserves somewhere. So the Caribbean is very much becoming open. You know, the whole question of the sea, seabed mining, you know, those are, you know, issues that I am suddenly starting to think, well, when you move away, when you think about the Caribbean as poor, you miss these kinds of connections. You miss questions of, but if we're so poor, why are so many people coming to buy up the beaches? Why are they still putting hotels? Obviously, there's some wealth there, there's something of value. But the question then focuses on, but why is it? Are we really poor, or is it that we don't have any control over the things we produce? So what I've been grappling with is how we can think about using the resources that are there for the people of the Caribbean to make their lives better and not have a repeat pattern as you see with ExxonMobil in Guyana, where you know the oil, as I said, reverts to its rightful owners. It's not Guyanese people. It's the people who have the expertise, the people who know how to mine oil, and then the oil goes to produce things that most Guyanese can't afford. So my question is, how do we look at these resources as a region rather than individual countries and try to find ways to exploit them so that they don't enrich a narrow sector, whether that narrow sector is foreign or Guyanese. But how do you make those benefits accrue to the region? And, you know, part of that, you kind of said, yeah, but climate change, oil, shouldn't we be moving away from oil? Why are we investing in oil? But the question is, but this is a resource. And, you know, Ghana is one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere. So can you just ignore the resource? And the question is then, how do you try to find ways? So I think in the chapter you read, I think my focus is really on don't invest your future in the oil, use the oil to then, you know, exploit or develop renewable sources of energy. But I think when you center climate change and when you think about the Caribbean's vulnerability to climate change, then, and also the environmental impact of the extractive industry on Ghana's pristine rainforests, the implications for its marine reserves if things go wrong, just the fact that the dredging process affects sea life, there really comes a point at which you have to say, is it worth it? You know, how do we try to find a way to center climate change while still addressing larger issues of Caribbean economic marginality? And I don't know the answer, but I know that this is something that I have to be more mindful about and think about how we can address this conundrum. Belize has, and that's not because of the superior awareness and sensitivity of the Belizean government, but after almost a decade of sustained public pressure, they eventually impose a moratorium on oil exploration. So it's possible. But I think part of how we think about development, and it's a core question of development, what does it mean? What does it mean to be poor? You know, when are we going to put a limit to things and the accumulation of things? When did the accumulation of things become a sign of wealth? So I think we cannot rethink centering the climate without thinking about how we live and how we organize society and what we value. And I think that's where I am going in terms of what I think the implications of centering the environment in economic development or in development, because let's forget economic development. Why is economic development siloed from development? You know, it's a multifaceted thing. I'm using a word that is deeply problematic. And that has a lot of baggage, but it's very difficult to come up with a new word. But we need to transform what this means. So
thank you.
that's what,
when you think about the sort of multifaceted aspect, I love that phrase that you used to describe climate change. One of the dimensions, I guess, is that it changes for some people the time horizons of how they think about oil exploration.
yeah.
And so you can imagine almost like a dash to exploit the oil before it loses economic or commercial value. And I wonder whether that's affecting Guyana in any way.
You know what? I think that Ghana has never really controlled its resources. I mean, most of us became independent, and that's something that is left out of the conversation. When we talk about, I'm not even going to other countries, but most of the world's resources were already tied up by the time independence was given. And that definitely is the case for the Caribbean. And independence did not change that. So the structures of powers, the structures of ownership remained largely unchanged. Ghana has gold. Ghana has, wonderful agricultural space. So the question is why is Ghana one of the poorest countries? And of course, it has a small population. And of course, there is corruption. But corruption is centered too much in the narrative. Because when you look at corruption, it then becomes an internal problem. It's not a structural problem, right? And you can say these old third world countries who, they just corrupt. They're basket cases. And it turns our attention away from the basic, deep, unequal structures that the world is now deeply invested and embedded in. So I think it would have been very difficult for Guyana, as one of the poorest countries in the region, to suddenly get this windfall and not say, hey, we have to. But you're right in that there is hopefully a shelf life to carbon-based sources of energy like oil. And yeah, it's a natural. When you thought of as poor all your life and you suddenly get this windfall, it's very difficult to turn your back on it when you don't have an alternative. But Ghana is particularly problematic because it's a divided society. And when you have oil in a highly racialized and coincidence of politics and race and that kind of tension, then it's not good. It really is not good, which is why I have my own position is that we need to have a regional approach to how we think about our resources, what we choose to exploit, how we choose to exploit that, and what kind of safeguards we put in place to ensure that there is some kind of democratic process for thinking about how we use the resources, for ensuring, because it's not going to help anybody if, all these resources just go towards enriching a few people.
So I love what you're saying there. And since you brought up the racialized context of this, I wanted to just say a word about that, because it's something that in this course that I've been teaching on politics of climate change this past semester, we've been paying particular attention to how climate change affects different races differently, and how, all of the sort of different dimensions, and also that race affects the lens through which we see the issue of climate change. And so let me just say a word about it in the United States, and then see whether it resonates for you in the context of the Caribbean. So, for instance, right, so Black Americans are often more susceptible to the health consequences of climate change than white Americans or other races for that matter as well. In particular, maternal health is really affected by extreme heat, and there's lots and lots of other characteristics. Many of these effects are relatively small, but there's so many of them that they add up to a really significant health consequence. And yet, you know, I think in this country, often climate change is, or environmental movement in general, has this kind of history of being kind of a upper middle class, white voter oriented movement. But actually, when the pollsters ask voters about climate change, Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to say that climate change is a serious issue and that governments ought to, really act on it. And so the level of concern is very much there, it maybe even at a higher rate. And so I just wonder how you see that issue kind of refracting climate politics in the Caribbean.
I think Ghana is different and the dynamics are different in that I think the question is more which group is in control of resources. So you tend to have electoral change, at least since the 90s, early 90s. You've had you've had a process that works, but it's very embedded in racial identity. So you'd have an entire government that is seen as, the Indian government or the Indian party, or an entire government that is seen as more, the African party. So in a sense, it's how you do what you do with the resources you have when you're in government, as opposed to the extent to which, the Indian community versus the Black are affected by climate change. That might be a different conversation when you look at indigenous communities that are largely in the interior in Ghana. And I cannot say I have enough specialized knowledge to address how these communities are likely to be affected. But these communities are likely to live closer to the land, more resource, more dependent on fisheries, more dependent on agricultural, although, of course, agriculture is definitely a big part of the economic activities that Indians engage in. So I don't want to go too deeply into Ghana. I have lots of Guyanese friends who know the dynamics better than me. But come back to the broader issue of race. I think, of course, race operates differently here. But I think a lot of the diseases that African Americans are susceptible to, that make them susceptible to COVID, for example, are also very present in the Black diaspora. Because there are historical reasons, you brought to this part of the world, your food, the sources have changed dramatically, and you're more open to diseases like hypertension. We won't even talk about the trauma of slavery and how that continues to live in people. But diabetes, those kinds of non-communicable diseases that are like the largest, the biggest health problems that we have in the Caribbean are also, I think, part of the problem that we have the same kind of issues in terms of health, which is a different thing from being treated differently and given a different level of care. In the Caribbean, that would more align with class, in that the communities that are most likely in Jamaica to be affected by lead from discarded car batteries tend to be poor communities. So, those, I think class is also an important element of it and how it manifests. So I think the problems will look a little different depending on where you are in the Caribbean.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'm leading this new lab, which is focused on climate solutions.
Mhm.
And of course, that's we often hear lots and lots of doom and gloom about climate change, and there's reason for it. We should be worried. We should be afraid. But I also think it's important to kind of look for the positives out there, and I don't just mean sort of like falsely looking for like good things in a bad problem. I mean, how do we move forward constructively with this? With the challenge that's ahead of us. And I see some glimmers of hope in US politics. I'm seeing it north of border in Canada, where I was born and raised. And I wonder whether you see any in the Caribbean politics. I mean, if you're looking across the region, any of the countries that you've studied.
Well, the Caribbean has, as part of the Caribbean community, they have adopted protocols on protecting marine life, so they're very much aware, and at the regional level, are trying to come up with frameworks for addressing these things. They have quite a few organizations and initiatives directed at mitigating disasters. They have the risk insurance facility that tries to help with providing some cover for countries that have been badly hit. And I think that they have the 5 Cs, which is looking at climate change. So they have organizations, and there's definitely a sense that this is something that we have to address. But I think I still think that's all superficial, but I don't think that is just unique to the Caribbean. I think we think that maybe if we can have electric cars, or if we can do certain things, then we can address climate change, more green energy. But I think it has to be deeper than that. As I said, how do you deal with your economy? How do you think about your economy differently, for example? And we're not there yet. I think that's, a big step, because those things are still national policy in the hands of individual governments. So I know that there has been a lot of work, and of course with the help of international organizations, we have had coral bleaching episodes, and there have been attempts to regrow coral that have been, pretty good and successful. But I don't think that when it comes to trawling the deep seabed and mining the deep seabed for minerals, that we really have a handle to say, no, this is what we'll allow, this is not what we'll allow, because it affects us more immediately and more directly.
Yeah, so when you think about it,
Belize is an example of we're leaving the oil in the ground, and that came from sustained popular protest because of the barrier reef, the blue hole, those things that are very important to Belizeans. So there's something that they felt that they had to protect.
That's terrific. I'm really interested in that example, actually. And it does seem like in that case, maybe the fact that you have such a tourist industry and that people's livelihoods depend on tourism, that an oil industry might threaten in some way or damage. That's how you get, people to really come out and block a fossil fuel project.
Yeah, but it depends on if you are invested in the tourism industry. I think the tourism industry in Belize looks very different from the tourism industry in Jamaica, for example.
Okay.
Where access to the beach is not something, the beach is not as much as part of the daily life of a Jamaican as it would be for a Grenadian, for example. A lot of people are alienated from the tourist sector. So what's there to protect?
Right.
If the beaches and the natural environment are there for the tourists, then you're not invested. So I think a lot of it has to do with your relationship to these sectors. And tourism frankly, I don't. I think in Grenada, the beach is so much a part of daily life that long before people think of this affecting tourism, they're going to think about how it affects their lives. And that's what you want to do. You want people to be centered in their own lives, not because this is going to affect something called the tourism industry or some tourist enjoyment of the beach.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you want it to be, this is my country, this is my beach, this is my major source of recreation, which is in Grenada.
Yeah.
I mean, I was visiting my parents because a few weeks ago, and I was quarantining in a hotel on Grand Anse Beach and the main beach. And every morning, at dawn and at dusk, Grenadians would just be walking up and down doing exercise, you know. And then, I mean, you have hotels all along the beach, but this is first and foremost a place for Grenadians to relax and enjoy. So that's what you want. You want to shift that kind of perception, not to an industry or sector, but to how people see these things as being important to how they live their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. And I mean, one of the things that is kind of running like a thread through our whole conversation, it seems like, is you have an economy with inequality and class and race and gender all there, and all the different dimensions of that differ by different countries, etc. And then climate change comes in, and the response to climate change starts to come. And it's unclear yet, I think, whether that exacerbates those inequalities and the class issues that you're raising, race issues that you're raising, or whether climate change can in some way be positive.
Or be mobilized as an issue to tackle all those things. Because I don't think that we can disentangle, you know, these things. I don't think we can disentangle the oil sector or the tourism sector. And I mean, in islands that have water lockoffs as a part of daily life, that doesn't happen in the tourist sector, right? You would not have a tourism sector if the hotels couldn't guarantee tourists water 24/7 at the highest pressure. But who suffers as a result of that? So there are these inequalities embedded already in the economy. So I think that if you want to do things like even a simple thing like reduce electricity consumption, well, maybe that's not, well, it's still based in oil, but reducing how you use water, being more careful with water conservation, you already see deep levels of inequality, and you know that some people are going to be more affected than others. So I think, and of course, the bauxite industry in Jamaica is an example of that. People have been pushed off their land because once the bauxite companies enter into an agreement to exploit bauxite, the people have no control anymore over it. I mean, it's not like like they get anything from the land because the bauxite doesn't belong to them.
Yeah.
So they just moved, you know, so they don't benefit from having homes on bauxite-rich land. So I'm saying that there's inequality embedded. It's a central part of the narrative. And I don't think you can touch one without touching the other.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
Well, I'm sensitive to the time, but I want to just give you an opportunity too to kind of have the last word. And do you have any kind of final reflections on how climate change?
I just want to ask you.
The politics. What's that?
I just want to ask you.
Yeah.
You have worked on the oil sector. Yeah. And how are you bringing climate change concerns into how you think about your own work and your analytical frames and so on?
Yeah, I've been just finishing up this book manuscript on international order and how oil politics is a part of that, and so is climate change. And in a sense, what we're going through right now in the global energy industry is a huge change, right? A huge transition in our energy systems. But we've been through these before in some sense. They're different, but there's parallels to previous energy transitions. And one that I know quite well and have studied a lot is the transition in 1973 with the big OPEC oil shock. And it's funny because we talked earlier about decolonization and how that has had impacts in some ways, but only superficial impacts in other ways, et cetera. And this was very much on the minds of oil producers, especially in the Persian Gulf, but around the world, Venezuela, others at this time, who saw nationalization of their oil sectors as, and this is their words, an economic sequel to decolonization, right? This idea that we want to take ownership of the resources in our territory and use them to benefit our own people. And of course, they were successful in the first part of that in terms of many of these countries did nationalize their oil sector. But of course, the way the revenues flowed, well, that's still an ongoing challenge. And of course, it gave rise to what social scientists now call the resource curse and all of the political and economic difficulties that are associated with that. But listen, that's more about me. You turned it all back on me, which was lovely, and I can talk all day about that. But I want to thank you for sharing your expertise, your perspective with us as we think about climate change as an issue that is very much at our front door, but it's also affecting different regions around the world, different peoples around the world. And I really appreciate you bringing your thoughts to it.
And congratulations on the establishment of the Climate Solutions Lab at Watson.
Thanks. Well, I'm delighted to have people like you involved in it, Patsy.
No, thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to hearing more.